experience has been, but this is perhaps one of the biggest questions, one of the biggest struggles that people have in believing in a God who is all-powerful and who's all good. My laptop's still starting, so it should connect in a moment. But one of the biggest questions people have, struggles people have, is how can I believe in a God who's all-powerful and who's all good at the same time? For many, this is fundamentally a philosophical or a logical problem. This is how David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, put it. And those of you who studied with Mark will know his voice. And he actually looks further back to the Greek philosophers. David Hume said, Epicurus's old questions are still unanswered. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is impotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Whence then evil? Do you see that? He has a philosophical problem, struggling with the reality of evil in the world. But for many of us, I suppose the majority, it's far more a personal, there's a little picture of David Hume has come up at last, but for many of us, it's far more a personal problem. When we ourselves suffer, when people around us, those we love, suffer, how do we make sense of that? It's also a very emotive question, and I'm going to show us a brief little clip from an interview with the British humanist, the chair of the Humanist Society, a guy called Stephen Fry. And you can see it's a very emotive question for him. He's asked by the Irish presenter, if you of course don't believe in God, but what if you were to appear before God? And he asked you, why should I let you in? What would you say to God? Let's hope this works.
Suppose what Oscar believed in as he died, in spite of your protestations, suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think. I'll say, bone cancer in children? What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in
No,
on that?
but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms.
So, very emotive. As I watched that again, I wondered, what suffering has been in his life that has led to that very emotional response. How do we respond to people when they say, I can't believe in God, when my young niece is dying of cancer? How can God possibly be good? And often whatever we might say might seem like cold comfort, especially coming from someone who hasn't suffered a lot. So I want to actually listen to the testimony of someone who believed in the goodness of God and who himself had suffered greatly. And I'm referring here, of course, to the Apostle Paul. I don't think we often appreciate the degree to which Paul had suffered in his life. Just listen for a moment to Paul's own testimony in 2 Corinthians 11 as he's comparing himself to other leaders in the early church. I have been in prison more frequently, been flogged more severely, and been exposed to death again and again. 5 times I received from the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day on the open sea. I've been constantly on the move. I've been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have often gone without food. I have been cold and naked. Paul had suffered. And yet, this is the same Paul who we just read from. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. How could he hold these two things together? I have a classic 3-point sermon. 3 points, I think, at least 3 points Paul would make, or maybe I'm just making them, but I think Paul would agree with these 3 points from Romans 8. What was it that enabled Paul to endure? Firstly, if you're a believer in Jesus, you know the ultimate cause of suffering. You have a God who suffered, and you have hope in suffering. Firstly, we know the ultimate cause of suffering. You know, every philosophy, every religion has some explanation for why is there suffering in the world, and therefore also some way to handle that suffering. For the atheistic humanist like Stephen Fry, suffering is simply the result of living in a meaningless universe. The best you can do is take this kind of stoic approach, grin and bear it. Maybe you can hope a little bit that with technological advancement we can help alleviate suffering a little bit. But basically life is going to be hard and then you die. For the Buddhist, suffering comes fundamentally from our unfulfilled desires. And so what we need to learn to do is to let go of those desires, let go of those attachments. That's how we solve the problem of suffering. For the Hindu, suffering is part of an endless cycle of karma, where I pay for the wrongs that I've done, either in this life or a previous life. In that kind of worldview, I shouldn't even try to help the suffering, because they're only going to have to suffer again at some future point for their wrongs. But you know, Paul here has a very different story, a story with a definite personal beginning, and the story of a definite end where all things are heading. The story of a good God who entrusted his good world to human beings to rule over as his children, to reflect his freedom and his glory. But very early on, and Paul alludes to it here in Romans 8, that story went wrong when we chose to live independently of God, to define good and evil for ourselves. As a result, Paul says here in Romans 8 that the whole creation has been subjected to frustration, to futility, to bondage, to decay. When he says here in verse 22 that we know that the whole creation has been groaning as in the pains of childbearing, where have we heard that metaphor before? Of course, if you know your biblical theology, it takes you right back to Genesis 3, to that original judgment on humanity's disobedience. The agonizing pain of childbearing is a constant reminder that our creation is under the judgment of God. Childbearing in the ancient world, as in many parts of the world today, is always a life-threatening event. And despite all of our technological advancements, we still haven't overcome that problem. But you know, it's also important to see here that Paul is not saying that we know in every instance why we suffer. He's not sort of making that sort of equation. With the second years, we were looking at John 9. Jesus actually says that the blind man was neither him nor his parents who sinned, that he was born blind. Paul's painting a far bigger picture here through our refusal as a whole to live under God's rule. Corruption and decay and death itself has come into the very fabric of creation, and now none of us can escape it. You know, one of the artists who I like is a secular band by the name of Depeche Mode. It sort of gives away my age. They were making music in the 80s and the 90s, the 2000s. And the lead singer has this poignant song where he expresses some of the groaning of creation. He was going through a very painful divorce, and he saw his young daughters suffering as a result of it. And these are the lyrics that he sings. For his daughters, he says, "Angels with silver wings shouldn't know suffering. I wish I could take the pain for you. If God has a master plan that only he understands, I hope it's your eyes he's seeing through." And then the chorus goes like this: things get damaged, things get broken. I thought we'd manage, but words left unspoken left us so brittle. There was so little left to give. It's a picture of the groaning, the pain, the brokenness of the world. And you know, if you're a believer in Jesus, you actually know the ultimate cause of that suffering. You know that in some ways it's connected to us. There's a moral dimension to it. Sometimes explicitly, when we ignore or exploit or say hurtful words to others, but sometimes implicitly, when we simply suffer as a result of the brokenness of the world. Did you notice that Stephen Fry, that's exactly what he denies, that we're in any way culpable of the brokenness of the world? How dare you create a world in which there's so much misery that is not our fault? He says he would say to God, really? Is murder not our fault? Are lives and theft not our fault? But also think about this for a moment. If you look at the world and you say it's all wrong, this is not the way that it's supposed to be, how can you say that unless you have some standard by which you're judging what's wrong in the world? If you accept Stephen Fry's story that the universe is simply a meaningless accident that came here from nowhere, that it's going nowhere, by what standard are you looking around at the world and saying this is wrong? This is not the way it's supposed to be. As C.S. Lewis said long ago, a man doesn't call a line crooked unless he has some idea of what a straight line looks like. We all have this innate idea of what is just, of what is right. There is real good and real evil in the world, Paul says, and it's a good and evil that God himself defines and remains sovereign over. When we suffer, it's not like God has taken his hands off the wheel of the universe. Did you notice here what Paul says in verse 20? That the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it. Who's he talking about? Well, he's talking about God himself. God himself is the one who subjected the creation to frustration. And while that might appear like a terrifying reality, God causing suffering, I think you need to ask yourself for a moment, would it not be more terrifying if my suffering was a result of God having lost control of his world? No, God is the one who subjected it, but he also subjected it, did you notice in verse 21, in hope. He did it in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and the glory of the children of God. He's always had a plan to restore his creation. And even more than that, and this is really the second point I want to make, he himself was willing to suffer in order to bring about that restoration plan. We have a God who suffered. If you go right back to the beginning again, to Genesis 3, just listen again to God's pronouncement on Satan, the embodiment of evil. We have that proto-evangelion, the first announcement of the gospel in Genesis 3:15. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. And really what this is saying, as we often say, is that history is now going to be characterized by this titanic struggle between good and evil. But eventually someone is going to arise, someone, the offspring of the woman within the human race, who's eventually going to crush the serpent's head, is going to overcome evil forever. But in that process, he's going to be struck on the heel, he's going to suffer. And really, the rest of the Bible story, as we well know, is the quest for who is going to be that one who's going to overcome evil. And of course, as we look at all the great heroes of the faith, Abraham, David, Moses, all of them eventually, at some point in their life, become takers rather than givers. All of them are overcome by evil rather than overcoming evil themselves. And it's only when we come to Jesus that the whole story changes. The wonder of the Bible story, which we're celebrating again at Easter time, is that God himself in Jesus Christ stepped into our world of suffering. He took our pain and our suffering for us in order to save us, in order to restore us to sons and daughters, to give us our inheritance as heirs of God's world. Just listen to those wonderful words in verse 17 again. If we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. If indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we might also share in his glory. We have a God who suffered, who calls us into that pattern of suffering in his life. And do you know what resources this actually gives you for handling suffering in your life? You know how unique this is amongst worldviews. In the ancient world, the idea of a God suffering, God on the cross was unthinkable. It's unthinkable for many today. For Muslims, can't possibly think that even a prophet would suffer like that. And yet it gives incredible resources to know that our God suffered for us. This is how Dorothy Sayers put it. I don't know if you've come across her, one of the first female graduates from Oxford. She was a good friend of C.S. Lewis, quite a prominent writer early in the 20th century. And she puts it like this. She said, "For whatever reason God chose to make man as he is, limited and suffering and subject to sorrows and death, he had the honesty and the courage to take his own medicine. Whatever game he's playing with his creation, he has kept his own rules and has played fair. He can exact nothing from man that he has not exacted from himself. He has himself gone through the whole of human experience, from the trivial irritations of family life and the cramping restrictions of hard work and lack of money to the worst horrors of pain and humiliation, defeat, despair, and death. When he was a man, he played the man. He was born in poverty and died in disgrace and thought it well worthwhile." Or another great theologian of the 20th century, John Stott, who went to glory in 2011, this is how he puts it in the cross of Christ. "I could never myself believe in God if it were not for the cross. The only God I believe in is the one Nietzsche ridiculed as God on the cross. In the real world of pain, how could one worship a God who was immune to it? I have entered many Buddhist temples in different Asian countries and stood respectfully before the statue of the Buddha, his legs crossed, arms folded, eyes closed, the ghost of a smile playing round his mouth, a remote look of his face, detached from the agonies of the world. But each time, after a while, I've had to turn away. And in imagination, I have turned instead to that lonely, twisted, tortured figure on the cross, nails through hands and feet, back lacerated, limbs wrenched, brow bleeding from thorn pricks, mouth dry and intolerably thirsty, plunged in God-forsaken darkness. That is the God for me. He laid aside his immunity to pain. He entered our world of flesh, blood, tears, and death. He suffered for us. Our sufferings become more manageable in the light of this. There's still a question mark against human suffering, but over it we boldly stamp another mark, the cross that symbolizes divine suffering. The cross of Christ is God's only self-justification in such a world as ours." Powerful words, I think. We have a God who suffered and who hasn't simply left us alone, but as Paul says here, he's also given us his Spirit who enables us to endure, his Spirit who reminds us that we are children of God even when we suffer, who enables us to pray, even when we don't have the words to pray. And I'm sure many of you have had that kind of experience before, or will have that experience in the future. Take heart, Paul says. The Father hears even those groans. The Spirit understands suffering as he brings our prayers before the Father, but he also perfectly knows the mind of the Father. And so he can actually pray for, we don't even know what's best for us sometimes. He knows what's best for us. He's interceding for us. And he's always doing that in line with the Father's will, as Paul says in verse 26. So we know the ultimate cause of suffering. We have a God of suffering, but finally and briefly, we have hope in suffering. What is it that makes suffering actually the most unbearable? I think it's two things. Firstly, not knowing that suffering is ever going to end. That suffering is just going to go on and on. But secondly, also believing that it's purposeless. This suffering is achieving nothing. There's no point to it. It's interesting. Many philosophers since Hume have actually shown that there's no logical contradiction between God being all good and there being suffering in the world. The real problem is with purposeless suffering, meaningless suffering. But if you look at your suffering and you say, this is completely meaningless, there's no point to it, you really have to ask yourself the question, how could you ever say that? How could you know that? I love the way that Tim Keller puts it. He says, if you have a God who's great enough and transcendent enough to be angry with that he hasn't stopped the suffering, you have to at the same time have a God who's great enough and transcendent enough to have reasons for allowing that suffering that you couldn't possibly imagine. You can't have it both ways. And Paul says here in verse 18 that our present sufferings are not worth even comparing to the glory that will be revealed in us. There's something ahead that's so glorious that'll even make our present sufferings understandable in the light of it. What is it that is lying up ahead? Well, it's nothing short of a cosmic renewal, the renewal of this whole physical material universe, even the renewal of our very bodies in which we suffer. And the creation itself will be liberated, Paul says, from its bondage to decay in verse 22 and brought into the glory and freedom of the children of God. We're awaiting the redemption of our bodies. Just as Jesus' body was raised, of course, that's the model Paul's looking back to. That's the guarantee, Jesus' resurrection, the first fruits. And that hope pulls us forward to that future day when all suffering is overcome. So our suffering will come to an end, Paul says. But secondly, we also know a purpose in it. So verse 28, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. If you're a believer, if you continue to love Jesus, it is your eyes that God is seeing through as you suffer. He has a purpose in it. And his purpose here, I think, is quite clear, that he's shaping our characters to be more like Jesus. And suffering plays an important role in that. I think many of us can testify that we've learned a lot more actually from our sufferings, our failures, our defeats, rather than from all of our successes and achievements. Suffering shapes you into a far humbler, far more patient, far more compassionate person. The kind of glory that God is working towards in those who love him. That we become people like Jesus, people who aren't focused on ourselves, people who are willing to even suffer in order to serve others. Suffering is never going to leave you unchanged. Suffering is either going to turn you in on yourself, make you bitter and cynical and self-focused. But as you keep coming to Jesus, and you come to him with your suffering, he can transform that suffering and turn you into a person who looks much more like him. And I want to end with the wonderful words of assurance that Paul gives there in verse 30. He speaks here of this unbroken chain, which many theologians have sort of drawn an ordo salutis out of this. But an unbroken chain that begins all the way back in eternity past with God's predestination. And he speaks so certainly of that future glorification that he even puts it in the aorist, in the past tense. This is true of you if you have trusted in Jesus. Those he predestined, he also called. Those he called, he also justified. Those he justified, he also glorified. If you're his child, he will bring you through that suffering. He will bring you to glory. And so would we know in our own sufferings that we know its cause, we have a God who suffered, and would we know this great hope that we have in suffering? Let me pray for us and ask that that would be true. Our Father, we do thank you again for this time this afternoon that we could meditate on the reality of suffering in the world. Thank you that your word is so honest that it doesn't promise us a suffering-free life. It doesn't promise us salvation from suffering, but in and through suffering. Father, thank you that you are able to use our suffering for your glory, that in many ways the glory is even greater, having come through the suffering. Lord, would you please minister to each one of us, even as we celebrate Easter in the few days ahead. Would you, if we're going through suffering, Lord, would you remind us again that we are your children and of the great hope that we have? And would you, if life is good at the moment, Lord, would you steel us? Would you prepare us for suffering that perhaps lies ahead? And we ask this for Jesus' sake. Amen.